Throughout the semester, we've discussed player interactivity and agency in terms of a game's gameplay, the choices presented to the player, and the game's narrative itself. With those things in mind, let's take a look at Naughty Dog's The Last of Us Part 2. The Last of Us Part 2 is a third-person action-adventure survival horror game developed by Naughty Dog and released on June 19, 2020. The game takes place 5 years after the events of The Last of Us, and is set roughly 25 years into a post-apocalyptic world after the outbreak of the cordyceps brain infection, which essentially turns people into zombie-like creatures after they die. The Last of Us Part 2 follows Ellie and Joel after the events of the first game. They've now settled down at Tommy's settlement in Jackson, Wyoming. However, things quickly go south for Ellie and Joel as a tragic event occurs, forcing Ellie to leave Jackson and embark on a quest for revenge as she seeks to carry out justice. From this point forward, I will be referring to The Last of Us Part 2 strictly as Part 2. Now, I think it's important to mention the fact that The Last of Us is my favorite game of all time, and Part 2 really isn't that far behind it. I've done 2 playthroughs of Part 2 since it released earlier this year, and it's constantly been on my mind because of the experience I had playing it. Naughty Dog has a fairly famous reputation as a studio for repurposing video games into essentially Hollywood blockbusters, and a large part of that is thanks to their work on the Uncharted series, which launched them into the stratosphere of the video game industry. Since then, they've generally stuck to the same formula, and they've stuck to this formula because it clearly works. And the formula is a third-person action-adventure game that uses the string-of-pearls storytelling method as described by famous game designer Schell to tell the story in an engaging and linear fashion. Schell describes it as, the string-of-pearls method gives the player an experience where they get to enjoy a finely crafted story, punctuated with periods of interactivity and challenge. In order to function at its best, the string of pearls needs a pre-established narrative. Since Part 2 relies so heavily on this pre-established narrative, it leaves little room for emergent stories to occur in terms of the stories that the game can produce. However, this method leaves plenty of room for emergent gameplay to occur, which speaks to the game's level of interactivity. The game gives the player an arsenal of weapons to use as Ellie, between her bow, her switchblade, her hunting rifle, and a variety of melee weapons that the player can loot within the world, and I'll dive deeper into the gameplay shortly. But firstly, there are absolutely zero story-related choices for the player to make as Ellie. The story functions as a pre-established narrative, leaving the player no room to interact with it and influence it in any way they want to. Marcello Pinucci described it as, a high degree of linearity is characterized by a strict order through which the story unfolds, as well as the absence of side stories or additional background story information for players to discover, with a consequent low degree of freedom. Instead, the player possesses freedom through the gameplay and the game world. The world is filled with creatures like runners, clickers, stalkers, and bloaters, as well as human enemies, and the combat sections are where the player is granted the most agency. The player can choose to use the game's stealth mechanics by going prone and sneaking around buildings and tall grass to kill enemies, or they can choose to use the game's action mechanics, tossing molotovs and running around. There's also the third option of sneaking around enemies and progressing to the next cutscene, avoiding combat entirely. The gameplay sections also present the player with opportunities to explore the pre-designed levels, often finding materials that they can then use to craft bullets, medkits, and other items to help them throughout the combat sections. In exploring the world, the player also finds training manuals that unlock new skill branches for the player, such as crafting, stealth, precision, and explosives. The player then uses supplements, another item found by exploring the world, to unlock various skills in these branches. This sense of exploration in the gameplay sections gives the player a pseudo-open world to explore in between cutscenes, and I really think this is a solid replacement for the player's inability to affect the narrative, as it gives space for emerging gameplay to occur. Instead of affecting the narrative, the player instead gets to affect the characters on a physical level, while manipulating the environments around Ellie to then personalize Ellie in a way that fits their playstyle. Outside of the game itself, the player has the option to enable certain gameplay modifiers which can change their experience. The modifiers range from video filters, audio filters, and gameplay cheats like infinite ammo or one-shot kills. These are ways for the player to radically modify their experience of the game, as it gives them the chance to personalize their playthrough of the game, making it different from the experience that the general audience has if they don't utilize the in-game modifiers.
to it.
Now, I think the most fascinating part of the game, by far, is the player experience and how the player experience ties into the game's narrative. The game spends its nearly 25-hour long story trying to examine the destructive cycle of violence through this post-apocalyptic world and through Ellie's journey, which is also the player's journey. For hours upon hours, the game asks the player to commit these incredibly violent acts of brutally murdering other humans in the world. And when doing this, sometimes the enemies will call out the names of the person you're killing. When I first experienced this, I felt like a genuinely awful human being. By giving the random NPCs names and having other NPCs call out to them as I, the player, killed them, invoked a visceral feeling of disgust in me and made me question my actions in a way I've never really done before in the medium of games. And in a medium where first-person shooters have become more and more casual, to question my violent actions was an incredibly powerful moment. I really think this speaks to Chris Crawford's notions of interactivity, as the game listens to the player's violent actions, then the player thinks about their own actions, and then the player decides whether to continue with combat and those violent actions, or to stealth around the enemies and avoid that combat section entirely, effectively speaking back to the game. The interesting part about this, though, is the fact that Naughty Dog made the gameplay feel so great. I've had difficulty thinking of another game where it feels this good to simply move around in, let alone engage in combat. The gunshots feel powerful, and the melee combat is so satisfying that it made me disregard the fact that these NPCs had names and their own lives before I, the player, killed them. However, this game also presents the player with one of the strongest cases of ludonarrative dissonance in video games. Ludonarrative dissonance is when the game's narrative told through the cutscenes doesn't coincide with the narrative told through the gameplay. For about 11 hours of the game, the player plays as Ellie on her quest for revenge. Then, in the middle of the game's story, the game then switches perspectives to Abby, the character that Ellie and the player have been seeking revenge on for the past 11 hours. The player has absolutely no choice in this perspective switch, and they're forced to play through Abby's journey, who, up until this point, has been the game's antagonist. This once again shows the limitations of Naughty Dog's infamous string of pearls storytelling, as it forces the player into a situation that they might not want to be in. Naughty Dog does a fantastic job of uniting the player's emotions with Ellie's emotions, as the tragic event has a profound effect on Ellie and the player. The player and Ellie remain united in their emotions and their desire for vengeance even up until the game's ending, which is where Ellie makes the significant choice to let Abby go instead of killing her, after she searched for her for months on end. The purpose of this choice is to comment on how the cycle of violence is one that never ends. If Ellie had killed Abby, then the people who love Abby would just go after and seek revenge on Ellie, just as she has done, and it's a never-ending cycle, essentially. Naughty Dog is making the powerful statement that violence begets violence, and they're forcing the player to reflect on the violence that they enact in their own personal life, but also in the medium of games as a whole, and in the game they just played. I personally love this choice, but this choice also causes the game to fall apart in the eyes of other players, as the gameplay is in direct conflict with this main theme. By naming the random NPCs in the game, it informs the player that they were a real, living person in this world who possibly had a family and other people to come home to. When the game's message of "it's better to forgive and grow than to hate and live in the past" directly nullifies the unforgiving murders seen during the gameplay sections, it creates a very real disconnect in the player's mind. One way to solve this would have been to give the player the agency to choose the ending for themselves. I know this departs from Naughty Dog's string of pearls storytelling method, but by giving the player the ability to choose whether to let Abby go at the end or to kill her, it would finally give the player a sense of control over the narrative and allow them to take the story of these characters into their own hands. However, Naughty Dog decided against this option, unfortunately lessening the game's degree of interactivity. All in all, The Last of Us Part 2 remains one of my favorite games of all time because of its bold storytelling choices. The game's ability to make me reconsider my own actions as a player is absolutely magical, and it evoked a feeling out of me that I've never felt while playing any other game. The in-game modifiers present within the game also allow for the player to tailor their experience of the game in a way that differs from other players, and when combined with the ability for players to engage in combat whichever way they choose, it really does result in a magical gaming experience unrivaled by any other. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this analysis of The Last of Us Part 2.